August 1944. Bavaria. The sky shimmered like metal, hot and silent, until a flash tore through it. A silver shape streaked past the formation of American P-51 Mustangs, faster than anything they'd ever seen. It wasn't diving, not climbing. It was cutting through the air, leaving behind only a hiss, a shimmer of heat, and the faint smell of ozone. Captain John Murphy was the first to see it. Christ almighty, what was that? His voice crackled through the radio, breathless. A moment later, the object turned, glinting in the sunlight, twin-jet exhausts burning white, and was gone before anyone could react. No propellers, no piston roar, just silence and speed. For a few seconds, the sky was still again. Then the bombers behind the Mustangs reported a blur crossing their path. 1, 2, 3, and then a formation broke apart. Smoke rose where moments earlier a B-17 had been flying steady and proud. Murphy gripped the stick tighter, scanning the empty air. It wasn't a plane, he whispered into the radio. It was something else. Back at the airfield in southern England, his debrief sounded like fiction. No Allied or Axis aircraft could move like that, not at that speed. The intelligence officer frowned, tapping his pen. Could it have been a new rocket? A V-weapon test? Murphy shook his head. No rocket flies like that. This thing turned. 2 days later, reconnaissance pilots brought back blurry photos taken over Augsburg, a sleek shape, swept-back wings, strange air intakes beneath the nose. The analysts thought it must be a prototype, maybe even a fake. But one mechanic, a former engineer, froze when he saw the outline. That's no piston engine. That's a jet. The rumor spread through the Allied squadrons like fire. The Germans had built something new, something impossible, but no one wanted to believe it. After all, air superiority belonged to the Allies now. The Luftwaffe was broken, running on fumes. A miracle plane didn't fit the story anyone wanted to hear. Still, the testimonies kept coming. Pilots swore they saw it flash past them, its wings slicing the clouds, too fast for tracers to follow. In debriefings, their descriptions were eerily consistent. Twin engines, strange exhaust trails, a sharp nose. The men began to call it the ghost in the sky. At first, command dismissed the reports as hysteria. Combat fatigue, optical illusions, perhaps a trick of light. No aircraft in existence can fly that fast, one intelligence officer said. Physics simply doesn't allow it. But physics was about to change. In a dim office in London, a colonel from Air Intelligence read a new dispatch from the OSS, a coded message from deep inside Germany. It mentioned a project name that meant nothing to him then, Messerschmitt 262. The report claimed it was powered not by propellers, but by gas turbines capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. He laughed at first, until the photographs arrived. They showed a German airfield littered with strange metallic skeletons, each one different from any known aircraft. The engines were short, wide, and mounted beneath the wings. On the back of one photo, a handwritten note read, First Operational Jet Fighter, Augsburg Trials, 1944. Suddenly, the impossible had a name. Messerschmitt Me 262. In the following weeks, sightings multiplied. Over France, Belgium, the Netherlands. Every time, the same pattern. A silver dart would appear, unleash a burst of cannon fire, and vanish before a single Allied plane could react. Dogfights became ambushes. P-51 pilots who once hunted German fighters now flew nervously, scanning the sky for glints of sunlight that might not be reflections at all. From captured German radio chatter, intelligence learned a phrase repeated again and again, Schwalbe, the swallow. A fitting name for something that came and went faster than the eye could follow. In Washington, reports arrived at the Navy Department marked urgent. A new enemy aircraft capable of outrunning everything the Allies had. The generals stared in silence. One of them muttered, if they build enough of them, they could take the sky back. But in the wreckage of war, numbers mattered more than speed. The Germans had built perhaps a few dozen, not nearly enough to turn the tide, or so they thought. Still, the psychological effect was immediate. Pilots started hesitating, breaking formation at the first sign of a blur. You can't fight what you can't catch, one of them said after losing his entire escort group. On the ground, mechanics found something strange embedded in the remains of a downed bomber. Fragments of 30mm shells, unlike any in Allied inventories. Proof that the ghost wasn't just a story. It was real, armed, and hunting. The war had always been fought by men. Now, it seemed, machines had joined in. Machines faster than fear itself. That night, in a smoky debriefing room, Murphy sat across from an intelligence officer who showed him the photos again. "Do you understand what this means, Captain?" the officer asked quietly. Murphy nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "It means the future's already here, and it's wearing a swastika." Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the hangar roof. The sound was almost like distant engines, a low, continuous hum that no one could quite place. Because somewhere, over the darkened fields of Europe, a new kind of thunder was rising. And in the static of the night sky, the whisper came again through Allied radios. "God help us. They're flying jets." And that was only the beginning. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They called it Project 1065. A number whispered in dim bunkers where the air stank of oil and secrecy, and even the walls seemed sworn to silence. Deep beneath the Bavarian soil, engineers worked by lantern light, sketching dreams in pencil on rough paper. Dreams that would soon become the most dangerous machine ever built. It began in 1939, when Germany still looked unstoppable. In Augsburg, a restless designer named Willy Messerschmitt stood over a drafting table, tracing the lines of an aircraft that had no propeller. Twin engines, streamlined fuselage, swept wings, a machine meant not to glide but to tear through the air. His assistant stared at the drawings. "It looks like something from the future." Messerschmitt didn't look up. "It is the future." At first, the Air Ministry dismissed him. "Jet engines. They explode before they start," one general scoffed. But across Germany, others were chasing the same impossible dream. In Dessau, an engineer named Hans von Ohain tested his experimental Jumo 004, a jet engine made of fragile alloys that barely survived a single run. On its third test, it exploded, shredding the room with steel fragments. When the smoke cleared, von Ohain was laughing. "It worked," he said, half deaf from the blast. Even if only for 10 seconds, it worked. Germany's war machine was hungry for miracles. The Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots over Britain, and Allied bombers had begun to rain fire on German cities. Messerschmitt promised salvation in metal and fire, an aircraft faster than any the world had ever known. The Air Ministry approved his project under the code named Me-262. Progress was slow, brutal, and expensive. The turbines melted, the fuel lines froze, the materials cracked under heat. Engineers scavenged nickel and chromium from church bells and hospital equipment to keep the engines from burning through their casings. When Allied bombs flattened the factories, they moved underground. Entire workshops hidden in tunnels carved into stone. In 1942, the impossible happened. The first prototype lifted off. For 12 seconds, it screamed across the sky, leaving behind nothing but a silver line and the stunned silence of its creators. Then the engine died, and the plane crashed in a field. Messerschmitt watched the flames in silence. "We'll build another," he said softly. A year later, the Me-262 flew again, higher, longer, faster. Pilots who tested it described the feeling as riding a thunderstorm. The sound was alien, a continuous roar that felt like it came from the earth itself. One pilot wrote, "At 800 kilometers an hour, the world ceases to exist. There is only speed." But in Berlin, politics overruled engineering. When Hitler saw the plane for the first time, his eyes lit up. "This is my miracle weapon," he said. "It will carry bombs and destroy England once more." Messerschmitt tried to object. "Mein Führer, this is a fighter, not a bomber. It must remain light." Hitler slammed his fist on the table. "Then make it a Blitz bomber. I want vengeance in the sky." That decision cost Germany a year, the most valuable year of the war. Engineers had to redesign the wings, strengthen the frame, rewire the fuel system. The jet's soul, speed, was sacrificed for payload. Even as they toiled in the dark, Allied bombers grew bolder, and the Reich's factories burned one by one. Still, in secret, the fighter version lived. The engineers called it Schwalbe, the Swallow. It was beautiful and deadly, capable of outpacing everything the Allies had. But it was also fragile. The engines lasted only 20 hours before they failed. The takeoff run was so long and dangerous that most jets were shot down before leaving the ground. Von Ohain noted in a letter, "Each flight is a race against our own creation. The engines eat themselves alive." In early 1943, a test pilot named Fritz Wendell took the Swallow on its first full-speed flight. Onlookers said it vanished, a blur too fast for the eye to follow. When he landed, trembling, he simply said, "We've built lightning." Word spread through the Luftwaffe like wildfire. Some called it Germany's last hope. Others whispered it was a curse, too complex, too late. But the truth was undeniable. The Me-262 could change the war. Production began in secret underground tunnels near Augsburg and Nordhausen. Slave laborers worked in suffocating heat, assembling engines by candlelight, surrounded by the smell of oil and fear. For every plane completed, a dozen men died. Yet the planes rolled out, each one polished like a weapon from another world. By mid-1944, the first combat squadron was ready. Pilots trained in silence, learning how to coax the delicate turbines into life. "Throttle too fast, and you'll die on the runway," their instructors warned. "Throttle too slow, and you'll die in the air." When they finally took off in formation, the ground crews watched, speechless. The jets screamed skyward, leaving behind clouds of dust and disbelief. Germany, battered, starving, half-ruined, had unleashed something the Allies were not ready for. As one mechanic wrote that summer, "It doesn't belong to this war. It belongs to the next one." But the next war had already begun, the war for the future of flight. And soon, the Swallow would spread its wings over the battlefields of Europe, not as a dream, but as a warning that even in defeat, genius could still kill. August 15, 1944. The sky above northern France was a sheet of pale blue fire, trembling with the roar of engines. Hundreds of American bombers pushed eastward toward the Reich, their silver bodies glinting like fish in a sunlit sea. Escorting them, a formation of P-51 Mustangs, sleek, confident, invincible. And then, out of nowhere, something cut through the formation like a blade through silk. Captain Bill Halsey saw only a flash, a glint of metal, a streak of heat. "He's coming straight at us," someone shouted over the radio. But by the time they turned, it was already gone. Seconds later, a bomber in the rear column erupted in flame. Another followed, its wings sheared clean off. What the hell was that? Halsey yelled. Static. Then a voice. It wasn't a plane. It was too fast. The enemy wasn't supposed to fly like this. Not yet. Not ever. That morning marked the combat debut of Adolf Galland's Jagdverband 44, the elite squadron chosen to pilot the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. To the Allies, it was a ghost, silent until it struck, gone before the eyes could follow. From his base near Munich, Galland had handpicked Germany's best survivors, aces who'd outlived hundreds of dogfights. They called themselves the Last Knights. But even they were terrified of their own machines. The Me-262 was unlike anything they had flown, temperamental, deadly even to its pilot. If you throttled too fast, the turbine would stall and tear itself apart. If you throttled too slow, you were a sitting duck. Their first attack lasted less than 3 minutes. The jets dived from 25,000 feet, closing in on the American formation at nearly 900 kilometers per hour. Each aircraft fired a single, devastating burst from its 430mm cannons, then vanished before a single Mustang could even lock on. In that blur of motion, 2 B-17s fell from the sky. The rest scattered, breaking formation in panic. On the ground, German mechanics cheered. "The Swallows are flying," someone cried. For the first time in months, the Luftwaffe had struck fear into the enemy again. But Galland was not celebrating. He knew the truth. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, sabotage from desperate workers. Every flight risked disaster before it began. Out of the 9 jets that launched that day, 3 never returned. One caught fire during takeoff, another exploded midair, and the third simply disappeared into the clouds. When Galland landed, his face was gray with exhaustion. "We can win the sky," he told his men quietly. But not the war. For the Allies, the shock was immediate. Intelligence officers in England pored over combat reports, searching for any logical explanation. "Propaganda," one general said. "They're lying." But film from gun cameras told another story. Blurred frames of a silver-winged shape streaking past faster than the eye could track. That night, Allied pilots gathered in the mess hall, speaking in hushed tones. "It looked like a comet," one said. "No engine noise?" another asked. "Just a scream, like wind tearing through metal." They started calling it Hitler's Phantom. Soon, every strange reflection, every sun flash became an omen. Pilots fired into empty air, convinced they'd seen the Me-262. The mere rumor of it was enough to shatter nerves. But even gods of speed had their weaknesses. The Me-262 was unbeatable in the sky, once it was there. But its takeoffs were long and painfully slow. The engines needed nearly a minute to reach full power, and during that minute the jet was an easy target. Allied pilots learned quickly. Instead of hunting the swallows in the air, they waited by their nests. By September, American fighters were patrolling above German airfields at dawn, waiting for the jets to rise. They called it rat catching. As soon as a Me-262 began to taxi, the Mustangs would dive, strafing the runway before the turbines could even roar to life. German engineers dug trenches and built fake runways, even mounted flak guns disguised as farm machinery. It wasn't enough. The Allies owned the sky by numbers alone, and for every swallow that took flight, 10 more were destroyed on the ground. Still, for those brief moments when they did fly, they were untouchable. In one mission, a single Me-262 downed 5 bombers before disappearing into the clouds. When the pilot returned, his hands were shaking too hard to unbuckle his straps. "They never saw me coming," he whispered. "No one ever will." Galland watched the war collapsing around him. Factories burning, fuel depots empty, the Reich shrinking by the week. But whenever the swallows rose, hope flickered, if only for seconds. "It's too late," one officer told him. Galland nodded slowly. "Maybe, but while we're in the air, the future belongs to us." The next morning, Allied reconnaissance photographed the wreckage of 3 Me-262s smoldering on a German runway. One had crashed on landing. The others had been bombed before takeoff. Among the debris lay a note scrawled in pencil on a torn maintenance log. "We fly faster than death. But death still keeps up." And yet, somewhere in the chaos, among the smoke and broken engines, the Me-262's shadow lingered. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a message, a warning that the next war would not be fought by men chasing each other through the clouds, but by machines that could outpace time itself. And for those still fighting, that realization was more terrifying than any bomb. They called themselves the Lightning Pilots. Men who, for a few minutes in the sky, felt like gods. But even gods needed fuel, and a runway that wasn't burning. Autumn, 1944. The war had turned into a slow collapse, a thunderstorm of defeat rumbling closer every week. The Luftwaffe, once proud and invincible, was now a ghost of itself. Fuel was rationed to the last drop, spare parts existed only in memory, and the once feared airfields were little more than smoking craters. Yet in those craters, a miracle still tried to fly, the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine capable of outrunning everything that chased it. Germany's last hope. Adolf Galland, commander of the jet squadrons, knew it was already too late. But he fought anyway. "If speed is all we have left," he told his pilots, "then we'll use speed to defy death." Each morning, the airfields trembled under the weight of silence. Mechanics in grease-stained uniforms crawled over the silver fuselages, coaxing life into dying turbines. The smell of fuel and desperation hung heavy in the air. Each takeoff was a gamble. An engine might fail, a piston might seize, a runway might vanish under the bombardment before the plane even lifted. American P-51 Mustangs prowled the skies above every known German base, waiting. They called it rat hunting. Whenever the jet engines began to whine, the Mustangs dove, unleashing gunfire before the Me-262s could gather speed. Some German pilots barely left the ground before dying in fire. Others were hunted down on their return, their landing gear blown apart as they tried to touch down on shattered runways. It was a war of seconds now. Whoever reached the sky first lived. One of those men was Walter Nowotny, a legend even among legends. At 23, he had more than 200 kills to his name. The Reich turned him into a symbol, a poster boy for invincibility. But inside the cockpit of his Me-262, even Nowotny felt fear. On November 8, 1944, his jet lifted from a rain-soaked airfield near Akmer. The weather was miserable, the visibility worse, but orders were orders. Protect the factories, the command read. Destroy all incoming bombers. He climbed through the clouds, turbines shrieking, instruments shaking. Below him, smoke rose from the ruins of towns that no longer existed. In his headphones crackled the voice of another pilot. 2 Mustangs, altitude 6,000, approaching from west. Nowotny pressed the throttle. The jet screamed forward like a living thing. He spotted the American fighters, dark silhouettes flashing through the mist, and fired. His cannon spat orange fire. One Mustang exploded instantly. The other turned sharply, vanishing behind him. Hit confirmed, he reported. Then silence. Moments later, his right engine began to cough. A red light flashed. Fuel pressure dropping. The turbine shuddered, then burst into flames. Smoke filled the cockpit. Nowotny coughed, his mask hissing. Right engine out. Going down. Ground control tried to respond, but his voice was already fading into static. Witnesses saw his Me-262 spiral down through the clouds, trailing black smoke. It hit the ground near Hizapi, exploding into fragments. When soldiers reached the site, they found only twisted metal and one half-burned flight glove. News of his death spread fast. To the Luftwaffe, it was more than a tragedy. It was the death of illusion. The lightning had failed to save them. Inside his underground bunker, Hitler raged. Sabotage, he shouted at his generals. You are betraying me. You have the greatest aircraft in history, and yet we lose? He demanded results, ordered impossible missions, threatened courts-martial. But there was no victory left to give. By winter, the fuel reserves were gone. Some jets were towed to the runway by horses because there wasn't enough gasoline for the trucks. Pilots practiced taxiing without engines to conserve what little kerosene remained. Gallen's diary from that time is brief, almost clinical. The machines are perfect. The world around them is collapsing. In the final months, only a handful of Me-262s were still flying. They were too few, too fragile, too late. American bombers ruled the skies, and German cities burned day and night. When the jets did appear, they struck like ghosts, one pass, one kill, then gone. But the Reich needed thousands, not dozens. Mechanics cannibalized broken aircraft, trading engine parts like currency. Some crews poured stolen alcohol into the fuel lines just to make the turbines start. Others stripped guns from wrecks to keep a single Me-262 armed. It was madness disguised as hope. On one frigid December morning, an airfield commander gathered his surviving pilots. There were 6 of them. Gentlemen, he said, our task today is simple. Take off. Nothing more. If you take off, you've already won. They laughed bitterly, but they went. Hours later, only 2 returned. One landed with both engines dead, skidding across frozen ground until it stopped in silence. The pilot climbed out, smoke rising behind him. I saw the enemy, he said quietly. I was faster than him, but not faster than fate. That night, Gallen stood at the edge of the runway, listening to the distant thunder of Allied bombers. He looked at the burned remains of the jets, their once glittering metal now twisted and blackened. We built the future, he murmured, but the future came too late. By the time the last Me-262 was destroyed, even the most loyal officers understood technology could no longer save them. Because speed, for all its glory, cannot outrun defeat. January 1945. Snow covered the wreckage of Germany. Cities lay in ruins, rail lines twisted and frozen, skies once filled with eagles now silent except for the distant drone of Allied bombers. But among the chaos, one order spread through the American intelligence network like fire. Capture a jet. Intact. At any cost. The Me-262 had become more than a weapon. It was the key to something greater, the future. Allied commanders wanted it not for the war that was ending, but for the wars yet to come. Reports from pilots painted a picture almost mythical. They come out of nowhere, one said. No sound, no warning, just a streak of silver and we're gone. Another wrote, if the Germans had 100 of them, the sky would belong to them again. Now, the Allies wanted to know how it worked. In a briefing room in London, officers from the OSS, the U.S. Army Air Forces, and British intelligence studied blurry reconnaissance photos pinned to a wall. The images showed narrow concrete runways hidden among forests, half-buried hangars, and long fuel lines running underground. At the bottom of one photo, an officer had scrawled 2 words, Jet Base. They called the plan Operation Lusty. Its mission: infiltrate captured airfields, recover wreckage, and, if possible, take an entire aircraft alive. By March, the Allied front pushed into Germany's industrial heart. The Luftwaffe was dying, but its secret bases still breathed. Intelligence intercepted frantic radio messages, orders to burn documents, to destroy engines, to bury prototypes. The race was on, not between nations, but between discovery and destruction. One night in April, near Munich, a convoy of American jeeps rolled through the darkness toward a half-bombed airfield. Their headlights were covered, their engines barely idling. At the front sat Major James P. McDonnell, a pilot-turned-intelligence officer. He carried one instruction from Washington: find the jet, bring it home. When they reached the base, the air reeked of burnt kerosene and cold metal. Hangars lay open, their roofs caved in, but beneath the rubble, gleaming wings. The unmistakable shape of an Me-262, its paint scorched, its engines half buried under debris. German engineers were still there, trying to set fire to the remains. Stop them, McDonnell shouted. Shots echoed in the night. A brief scuffle, a few shouts in German, and then silence. They had it. A complete Me-262, engines intact. Under floodlight, mechanics worked through the night, clearing debris, patching holes, checking wiring. The Americans stood around the aircraft in awe. It looks alive, one whispered. McDonnell touched the metal skin. It was cold as ice, yet seemed to vibrate faintly under his palm. By morning, they had it loaded onto a transport truck, its nose peeking from the tarp like a captured beast. Within days, it was flown piece by piece to France, then shipped across the Atlantic to Wright Field in Ohio. There, engineers and test pilots gathered like pilgrims around a relic. They studied every rivet, every circuit, every scar of design born from desperation. Captain Charles Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, was among those who first saw it. He later recalled, it looked wrong, alien, like something that had fallen out of the future. When they reassembled it and powered the engines for the first time, the sound was unlike anything ever heard on American soil. A shriek, deep and mechanical, like thunder trapped inside a tunnel. Test pilot Robert Bob Hoover volunteered to fly it. Before takeoff, he joked to his ground crew, "If I don't come back, tell my wife I found heaven at 500 miles an hour." At 3 p.m., he pushed the throttle forward. The jet rolled slowly, hesitated, and then leapt from the runway, tearing across the sky with impossible speed. The ground crew craned their necks as it vanished into a line of white vapor. Minutes later, his voice crackled through the radio, half laughing, half terrified. "This thing isn't an airplane, it's a slingshot." When he landed, his hands were trembling. "It's twice as fast as anything we've got," he told the engineers. Twice as fast, and twice as deadly. If they'd had this 6 months ago, we'd be fighting over London again. That line made it into the official report. It was underlined twice. In Washington, generals read the document in silence. Then one of them spoke. "Gentlemen, we're not looking at the end of a war. We're looking at the beginning of another." Within weeks, American and British laboratories were dismantling captured German jets piece by piece. Every detail was recorded, photographed, copied. Drawings circulated through secret workshops under names like Project Jetstream and Operation Seahorse. What began as an act of war became an act of imitation. On the ground in Germany, the hunt continued, not for aircraft this time, but for the men who built them. Because if the Allies could not outfly the Me-262, they would have to outthink the people who made it. And somewhere, in the rubble of a defeated empire, those men were waiting, tired, hungry, and too valuable to die. The war was ending. But the Real chase, the one for the mind of the enemy, was only beginning. May 1945. The war in Europe was over, but the race for the future had only just begun. When the American troops entered Bavaria and Saxony, they expected surrender. Instead, they found laboratories that looked like the wreckage of another planet. hangars filled with engines that had never flown, blueprints of machines no one yet understood, and walls scribbled with formulas that could have changed history. Everywhere they went, the same smell lingered: burnt metal, oil, and fear. In one underground facility near Augsburg, the air was thick with dust and silence. On the walls hung half-finished turbine blades, precision tools abandoned in mid-use. And on the chalkboard, written in neat, fading handwriting, JUMO 004B, thrust correction data. The signature below belonged to one of Germany's top engineers, a man the OSS had been hunting for weeks. Operation Paperclip had begun. It wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. The orders were simple: capture German scientists, engineers, and technicians before the Soviets did, and bring them to America. Not as prisoners, but as assets. Men who had once built weapons for Hitler were suddenly worth more than gold. Colonel Donald Putt, a U.S. Air Force intelligence officer, described the moment they found one of the Me-262's design teams hiding in a farmhouse. They looked half-starved, he wrote. But when I asked them about their work, their eyes lit up. They didn't care who they worked for. They just wanted to keep building. Over the next few months, convoys of trucks rolled through ruined cities, loaded not with ammunition but with ideas: engines, turbines, notebooks, even entire test rigs. Engineers were quietly offered contracts: new homes in Ohio, Texas, or New Mexico, new identities, and the promise that their past would disappear. Some American officers protested. "These men serve the Reich," one said in a classified memo. "They built machines meant to kill our pilots." The reply from Washington was cold and simple: "They will now serve the future." By autumn, the first group of former Luftwaffe engineers had arrived in the United States under assumed names. Among them were experts in jet propulsion, aerodynamics, and advanced metallurgy, the minds behind the Me-262 and the V-2 rocket. They were assigned to work in secret laboratories that would later become the foundation of the U.S. Air Force's Research Command. At Wright Field, the same place where the captured Me-262 had first flown under American colors, the Germans were ushered into clean workshops filled with unfamiliar machines. It felt like stepping into another world. One of them later wrote, "They had won the war, but we were the ones who knew what came next." They began redesigning engines, testing new alloys, sketching aerodynamic profiles. Their work quietly shaped the prototypes that would soon become the P-80 Shooting Star and the F-86 Sabre, the jets that would dominate the skies of Korea only a few years later. It was the strangest partnership in history. Yesterday's enemies building tomorrow's power. But beneath the progress lay a shadow. Not everyone could forget what these men had done. In the mess halls of Wright Field, whispers spread among the American engineers. "That guy built bombs for the Nazis," someone would mutter. "Now he's designing wings for us." Some refused to work with them. Others convinced themselves that it was necessary. "If we don't take them," one officer said, "the Russians will." And the Russians were already moving. In the east, the Red Army captured German rocket engineers by the hundreds, sending them to work in Siberia under guard. Two superpowers now raced to possess the same knowledge born in the same laboratories. The Cold War had not yet been named, but its first seeds were already planted in the ashes of the Reich. Among the documents recovered from the Me-262 project was a letter written by one of its engineers just before the surrender. "We built the jet to defend our country. Now it will defend someone else's. Perhaps one day, it will reach the stars instead of battlefields." He wasn't wrong. Within a decade, those same minds would contribute to the birth of NASA, to the rockets that would carry men beyond the sky. But in 1945, that future still smelled of smoke and compromise. As American officers signed off the final shipment of technical experts, a young lieutenant noted in his report, "We took their machines. We took their minds. The question is, what part of their past did we bring with them?" No one answered. Outside, the engines of transport planes roared to life, carrying a generation of defeated scientists toward a new war, one without gunfire, but far more dangerous. And so, from the ruins of Germany, a new empire began to rise, not of territory or ideology, but of technology. The jet that once fought for a dying nation was about to give birth to the modern world. The sound came first, a low, steady roar that rolled across the desert like a heartbeat. It was 1947, 2 years after the war. The Me-262s were gone, their wreckage scattered across Europe, their engineers now working under new flags. But on a remote runway in California, a new jet waited for clearance. Sleek, silver, and restless. The ground crew stood back as the pilot, a young man named George Welch, climbed into the cockpit of the XP-86 Sabre. Its swept wings, its turbines, its aerodynamic lines, all whispered of another machine, born in another country, under a darker sky. "Ready for takeoff," Welch said into the radio. The engines screamed to life. The Sabre rolled forward, gaining speed, faster and faster until it left the ground and climbed into the blue. At 30,000 feet, Welch eased the throttle and smiled. "She flies like she wants to run away from the world," he said. Below, the engineers watched, taking notes. Among them were two Germans who once worked on the Me-262. They said nothing, but as the jet disappeared into the clouds, one of them whispered to the other, "You see? It lives again." The Me-262 was gone, but its spirit had taken flight once more, reborn as the age of jet aviation began. By the early 1950s, every major power had its own jets. The United States had the Sabre, Britain the Meteor, the Soviet Union the MiG-15. All of them owed something to the same blueprint, the same engines, the same aerodynamic theories born in the chaos of 1944. When American pilots went to war again, this time over the skies of Korea, they met their equals, Soviet-built fighters shaped by German hands. Jet battled jet, past battled past, and the legacy of the Me-262 became a duel that spanned the horizon. But for those who had seen the original, who had watched it slice through the air like lightning over the ruins of Europe, the memories never faded. An American veteran, interviewed years later, recalled, "I saw one once, near Nuremberg. It went past so fast, my instruments froze. I thought it was a trick of the light. But it wasn't. It was the future, and it didn't belong to us yet." Historians would later call the Me-262 the machine that arrived too soon. A marvel that could not save the regime that built it, but would shape the entire world that followed. In Germany, the surviving engineers lived quiet lives. Some joined NASA, others disappeared into the growing web of Cold War projects. A few never built anything again. They carried the same guilt that haunted the ruins of their country, the knowledge that their genius had first been born to kill. One of them, years later, wrote in his memoir, "The jet was never evil. It was just fast. It was people who gave it a purpose." Meanwhile, in museums across the world, the Me-262 stood silent, its fuselage polished, its swastikas removed, its cockpit sealed behind glass. Tourists walked by without realizing that every modern jet, every supersonic flight, every rocket that pierced the edge of space, all began with this strange, dangerous dream that once roared across a dying empire. In 2006, engineers in Germany rebuilt a flying replica using original blueprints. When they started the engines for the first time, the sound rolled across the runway just as it had 60 years before, deep, metallic, alive. People wept, not out of nostalgia, but from awe. For a brief moment, the ghost of 1944 lived again. Standing near the runway was an elderly American veteran, one of the men who had once fought against it. When asked how it felt to see the Me-262 take off again, he said quietly, "It's strange. Back then, we feared it. Now it's history. But you know what? Even now, when I hear that sound, my heart still races." The jet roared past the crowd, banked gracefully, and disappeared into the sun. That was how it always ended, with speed, with silence, and with a sky that never looked the same again. Because the Me-262 was more than a weapon. It was a question of what happens when humanity invents something faster than its own understanding. It didn't save the Reich. It didn't win the war, but it changed the shape of the world. And long after the pilots were gone, and the empires they fought for had turned to dust, its echo remained, the sound of the future, born too soon.